Are you guys excited for today's story?
Yes. Can you tell us about the boy that flew too close to the sun?
Icarus. Everyone remembers his famous fall. The story of Icarus has been told for centuries as a warning against the dangers of hubris and youthful arrogance. I remember the boy's desperate fall from the sky and the heartbroken father who could only watch. This single, tragic moment has become one of the most enduring myths of all time. That powerful tragedy, however, is merely the final, heart-wrenching chapter of a much larger saga. It is a story that begins decades earlier, rooted in genius, jealousy, and a terrible crime. To truly understand why Icarus flew, we must first understand who his father was and the terrible secrets he carried. Our story begins in the bustling, competitive, and innovative heart of ancient Athens. In this city lived a man who was a direct descendant of the city's ancient kings. His name was Daedalus, and he belonged to the royal house of the Erechthiades, a lineage that commanded respect. He established his workshop in a district known for its artisans, and it quickly became the epicenter of a revolution. Daedalus was a master craftsman, an inventor whose mind worked in ways no one had seen before. It was said that the goddess of wisdom and craft, Athena, had personally blessed him, guiding his hands and filling his mind with inspiration. His workshop a place of constant creation, Daedalus was credited with inventing fundamental tools that would shape civilization, including the axe and the plumb line. He also developed glue and perfected the use of the ship's mast and sail, transforming carpentry and navigation forever. Daedalus's true genius, however, was most apparent in his art. Before him, sculptures in the Greek world were rigid, lifeless figures. They stood stiffly, with arms fixed to their sides and blank, emotionless faces. But he changed everything. He was the first to create sculptures that seemed alive. He chiseled figures with their legs slightly parted as if they were in mid-stride. He freed their arms from their sides, giving them gestures and poses that suggested movement and intention. His statues, known as Daedalic sculptures, had open, seeing eyes and faces that conveyed real emotion. These creations were so lifelike that they unnerved the people of Athens. It was whispered that his sculptures, called automatos, had to be tied down at night to prevent them from walking away on their own. He developed techniques to create realistic, jointed figures, pioneering a new era of naturalism in art. His reputation spread far beyond Athens, and he was hailed as the greatest inventor and artist of his age, a figure whose contributions were as significant as those of any philosopher or king. It was in this golden period of creation and acclaim that Daedalus took on an apprentice, his own nephew, a boy who showed a spark of that same inventive genius. Unbeknownst to him, this decision would mark the beginning of his downfall. The boy's name was Talos, though some knew him as Perdix, and he was there to learn the sacred arts of creation and invention. From the moment Talos first stepped into the workshop, it was clear he was no ordinary apprentice. Where other students saw tools, Talos saw possibilities. Where they saw finished products, he saw the potential for improvement. Daedalus, a man whose pride was as finely crafted as his sculptures, initially saw the boy's talent as a reflection of his own superior teaching. He watched with a stern but satisfied eye as Talos absorbed every lesson, his small hands learning to guide a chisel with an unnatural grace, his young mind grasping complex principles of mechanics and architecture with astonishing speed. The boy was a prodigy. One afternoon, while walking along the shores of the Aegean, Talos picked up the skeleton of a fish. He ran his thumb along the serrated edge of its spine, feeling the row of sharp, uniform teeth. A flash of inspiration ignited in his mind. Back in the workshop, he took a flat piece of iron and painstakingly notched its edge, mimicking the fish's spine. He had created the first saw, a tool that would revolutionize the very act of building. Daedalus, upon seeing the invention, felt a complex mixture of pride and a cold knot of unease forming in his stomach. The invention was brilliant, something he himself had not conceived. Talos's genius was relentless. He watched the steady, circular motion of a spindle and devised the potter's wheel, a machine that allowed for the creation of perfectly symmetrical vessels with a speed and precision previously unimaginable. Then, using two iron rods joined at a pivot, he created the first compass, a device capable of drawing a perfect circle, an invention that would become fundamental to both geometry and construction. Each creation was a triumph, and with each one, the whispers in Athens grew louder. The city's patrons and craftsmen began to speak of Talos not just as Daedalus's gifted apprentice, but as a future master who might one day surpass the great inventor himself. This was a possibility Daedalus could not endure. His identity was fused with the title of the greatest. He was the descendant of Athenian kings, the chosen craftsman of Athena, the man who made statues that could walk. The thought of being eclipsed, especially by his own student, his own blood, was a poison that seeped into his soul. His praise for Talos became strained, his lessons grew shorter, and a cold distance replaced the warmth of mentorship. He would watch Talos from across the workshop, his face a mask of contemplation, but behind his eyes, a dangerous jealousy burned. He saw the boy's youthful ambition as a direct challenge to his legacy. The breaking point came on a clear, bright day. Under the pretext of surveying the city for a new temple design, Daedalus led Talos to the highest point of the Acropolis, the sacred rock that stood as the crown of Athens. Below them, the city sprawled out in a tapestry of rooftops and winding streets. They stood at the edge, the wind whipping at their tunics. Daedalus pointed toward the horizon, speaking of sight lines and architectural principles, drawing his nephew's attention away. In that moment, with the whole of Athens as his witness, Daedalus's internal battle ended. The pride, the fear, and the all-consuming envy coalesced into a single, horrific act. As Talos leaned forward to get a better view, Daedalus placed a firm hand on his back and pushed. There was no final cry for help, only the sudden, shocking silence as the boy's small frame disappeared over the edge. Talos plummeted toward the hard stone streets below, but his patron goddess, Athena, who had watched his budding genius with favor, would not allow his story to end as a crumpled body on the pavement. In a flash of divine intervention, she swooped down, catching him in her embrace mid-fall. His body transformed. Feathers, the color of earth and dust, sprouted from his skin. His arms elongated into wings, and his dying gasp was reshaped into the sharp, panicked cry of a bird. He was no longer Talos, the boy inventor. He was now a partridge, a creature that would forever remember the terror of its great fall. Crying out, it fluttered away, never again to soar to great heights, content to stay close to the ground, forever wary of the sky. Daedalus stared at the empty space where his nephew had been, his heart pounding with the cold shock of his own actions. He scrambled down from the Acropolis, his mind racing to form a lie. The strange appearance of the partridge, a bird not commonly seen in that area, and the undeniable evidence of the fall led to his arrest. He was brought before the Areopagus, the ancient and solemn high court of Athens, held on the hill where the god Ares himself had once been tried. There, under the stern gaze of the city's wisest judges, Daedalus, the master inventor, stood as a common murderer. He could offer no defense for his actions. The evidence of his jealousy was known throughout the city, and the divine intervention of Athena was taken as a sign of his guilt. The verdict was swift and absolute: banishment. Stripped of his titles, his workshop, and his home, Daedalus was cast out of the city that had once celebrated him. His name, once a symbol of human ingenuity, was now forever stained with the blood of his nephew. Taking his young son, Icarus, a boy still too young to understand the dark truth of his father's exile, Daedalus boarded a ship and set sail, a disgraced and broken man. The forced departure from Athens was a heavy blow. Their destination was the island of Crete, a powerful and ancient kingdom ruled by the formidable King Minos. The name Minos was spoken in hushed, respectful tones throughout the Greek world, a king whose dominion over the seas was absolute and whose temper was legendary. As their ship approached the Cretan coastline, the sheer scale and sophistication of the Minoan civilization became apparent. Unlike the rugged, fortified cities of mainland Greece, the coastline of Crete was dotted with open, vibrant port towns. The Minoan people were masters of the sea, and their ships, sleek and fast, controlled the trade routes of the eastern Mediterranean. The island itself was lush and fertile, a stark contrast to the rocky, arid landscape of Attica they had left behind. When they finally disembarked and made their way inland, they were met with a level of architectural grandeur and artistic expression that even Daedalus, the master builder, found breathtaking. The Minoan civilization, which had flourished on Crete for over 1,000 years, was at its absolute zenith. They were a people who seemed to live in harmony with their environment, their art filled with images of leaping dolphins, graceful octopuses, and charging bulls. Their journey led them to the heart of the kingdom, the magnificent palace of Knossos. It was a sprawling, complex city in itself, covering acres of land with a bewildering array of courtyards, halls, corridors, and chambers. The palace was a masterpiece of engineering, with advanced plumbing systems that provided running water, light wells that illuminated the interior rooms, and massive storerooms filled with giant pithy jars containing grain, olive oil, and wine. Daedalus's reputation as a peerless inventor and artist had traveled faster than his ship. King Minos, a shrewd and ambitious ruler, had heard tales of the Athenian who could create statues that moved and breathed. He saw in Daedalus a valuable asset and a tool he could use to further glorify his own reign and solidify the cultural and technological supremacy of Crete. Minos welcomed Daedalus and Icarus into his court with open arms and a display of royal generosity. He offered them luxurious quarters within the palace complex and promised Daedalus a workshop grander than any he had known in Athens, complete with the finest materials and the most skilled artisans on the island to assist him. For a man who had just lost everything, it was an offer he could not refuse. Minos was the son of the great god Zeus and the mortal princess Europa, and he ruled Crete with a divine mandate. His court was a glittering world of wealth, power, and intricate protocol. Priests and priestesses moved through the corridors, their robes decorated with sacred symbols, while nobles and courtiers plotted and schemed in the shaded porticos. Daedalus, ever the keen observer, quickly understood that this was a world where favor was currency and loyalty was constantly tested. For Icarus, the palace was a wonderland. He had grown up in the dusty, work-focused environment of his father's Athenian workshop. Now, he found himself in a world of color, music, and endless corridors to explore. He was of an age with the royal children, and he quickly befriended the children of the court. He would spend his days chasing them through the palace gardens, playing games in the sun-drenched courtyards, and listening to the stories of gods and heroes told by the court poets. He was a bright, curious, and adventurous boy, and he thrived in the vibrant atmosphere of Knossos. Daedalus, watching his son's happiness, felt a pang of relief. Perhaps, he thought, this new life could be a true home for them. Perhaps here, the ghost of Talos would finally cease to haunt him. The king was true to his word. Daedalus was given a grand workshop and a team of Crete's best craftsmen. His first tasks were to design and create new works of art and architecture to further beautify the already magnificent palace. He designed intricate jewelry for the queen, ceremonial axes for the priests, and new, more lifelike frescoes for the royal chambers. He introduced new tools and techniques to the Cretan artisans, and his influence began to spread throughout the island. His work was, as always, brilliant. He created sculptures that seemed to capture the very essence of the Minoan spirit, fluid, dynamic, and deeply connected to the natural world. He designed a grand, ceremonial dance floor for Princess Ariadne, a marvel of intricate inlaid patterns that mimicked the twisting paths of a maze. For a time, Daedalus found a measure of contentment in his work. He was creating again, his hands and mind occupied, his genius once more recognized and celebrated. He quickly became an indispensable part of the royal court, the king's go-to man for any problem that required a creative or technical solution. Minos consulted him on matters of engineering, architecture, and even military technology, Daedalus was showered with honors and wealth. He lived as a prince within the palace walls. His relationship with King Minos was one of mutual benefit. Daedalus provided the king with wonders that enhanced his prestige, and Minos provided Daedalus with protection, resources, and a life of comfort. It was a golden era for the exiled inventor, a second act he had never thought possible. But the gilded cage was still a cage. Daedalus soon learned that King Minos's generosity came with a price. He was a guest, an honored one, but he was also a possession. The king made it clear that Daedalus's skills were now the exclusive property of Crete. He was forbidden to leave the island. The ships that had once seemed like symbols of Cretan prosperity now looked like prison guards, patrolling the coastline to prevent any unauthorized departures. Daedalus began to feel a familiar sense of confinement, a growing unease that reminded him of his final, suffocating days in Athens. The freedom to come and go as he pleased, the freedom to choose his own patrons and projects, was gone. He was, in effect, a highly paid servant, bound to the will of a powerful and unpredictable master. Daedalus's downfall in Crete began with King Minos's own ambition. To secure his claim to the throne of Crete against his rival brothers, he stood upon the shore and prayed to Poseidon, the great earth-shaker and god of the sea. He asked for a sign, a clear and undeniable mark of divine approval that would silence all challengers. He made a solemn, public vow. Whatever creature the god sent forth from the ocean, he would offer it up as a sacrifice on Poseidon's altar. The sea god heard his prayer. The ocean began to churn, and from the waves, a bull of impossible beauty emerged. Its hide was the color of pure, driven snow, a startling white against the deep blue of the sea. Its horns were perfectly curved crescents that shone like polished mother-of-pearl, and its eyes were deep, intelligent pools that seemed to hold the ancient secrets of the ocean. The people of Crete gasped, falling to their knees. It was a miracle, a divine endorsement of Minos's rule. Minos himself was overcome. The bull was magnificent, a perfect specimen, a testament to the power of the gods. And as he stared, the corrosive acid of human greed began to eat away at his pious vow. Such a creature was too perfect for the sacrificial knife. Its blood was too precious to be spilled upon a cold stone altar. It was a bull fit for a king, an animal that could sire a herd of unparalleled quality. It was a living symbol of his own divinely ordained power. In a fateful act of arrogance, Minos decided to deceive the god. He secretly had the white bull led away to join his own royal herds. In its place, he selected a common, unremarkable bull and had it slaughtered in Poseidon's name. He believed he was clever, that a god as mighty as Poseidon would not notice or care about such a minor substitution. However, the god did notice. This was an act of profound disrespect, and it would bring a terrible curse upon his house. Poseidon's vengeance was not swift and clean like a lightning bolt from Zeus. It was slow, insidious, and exquisitely cruel. The god would not punish Minos directly, for the king was still under the protection of his father, Zeus. Instead, Poseidon targeted the king's wife, Queen Pasiphae, aiming his retribution at the heart of Minos's lineage and honor. Pasiphae was herself of divine stock, the daughter of the sun god Helios, a woman known for her grace and dignity. The curse did not strike her with a physical ailment, but with a psychological torment of the most grotesque nature. It started as a subtle, unsettling fascination. The queen would find her gaze drawn to the royal pastures, her eyes constantly seeking out the magnificent white bull. She would watch it for hours as it grazed, its powerful muscles moving with a fluid grace. This fascination soon morphed into an obsession. The image of the bull began to dominate her thoughts, invading her dreams. The obsession then twisted into a desire, a deep carnal longing that horrified and shamed her. It was a physical ache, a fever in her blood that no mortal physician could diagnose or cure. She fought it with all her will. She locked herself away in her chambers, fasting and praying, begging the gods to release her from this monstrous affliction. But the curse was relentless. The desire grew more powerful each day, a raging fire that consumed her from the inside out. Her beauty began to fade. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, her skin grew pale, and her once commanding presence was replaced by a haunted, furtive energy. She became a ghost in her own palace, her torment a secret she could share with no one. King Minos, consumed by his own affairs, remained callously ignorant of his wife's suffering, dismissing her seclusion as a bout of female melancholy. Finally, when the agony became unbearable, when she felt she was on the verge of madness, Pasiphae made a desperate decision. There was only one person on the island who possessed the intellect and the skill to potentially offer a solution, no matter how unorthodox. Daedalus. In the suffocating secrecy of a moonless night, she summoned the Athenian craftsmen to her private apartments. Daedalus entered the queen's chambers expecting a commission for some new marvel. He found Pasiphae in a state of utter collapse, her regal composure shattered. In halting, whispered words, her voice choked with shame and desperation, she confessed the whole sordid story. The curse, the obsessive desire, the torment that was driving her mad. She did not ask for a cure. She knew she was in the grip of a god's wrath. She asked for something far more shocking, something that made the blood run cold in Daedalus's veins. She asked him to build a device, a contraption, that would allow her to mate with the white bull. Daedalus was speechless. His mind, accustomed to the elegant logic of mechanics and architecture, recoiled from the sheer monstrosity of the request. It was an affront to nature, to the gods, to the very essence of human dignity. He was an artist, not a panderer to abominations. His immediate impulse was to refuse, to flee from the room and the madness it contained. But he was trapped. He looked into the queen's eyes and saw not a monster but a victim, a puppet being cruelly manipulated by a vengeful god. Her agony was real and profound. He also recognized the implicit threat. He was an exile, his life and prosperity dependent on the whim of the royal family. To deny the queen, a daughter of the sun god, could mean his immediate ruin. She could accuse him of anything, and he would have no defense. Fear, pity, and a morbid, craftsman's curiosity warred within him. The problem, in its sheer, perverse complexity, was a challenge his inventive mind could not entirely resist. With a heavy heart and a sense of profound self-disgust, he agreed. He began the most difficult and shameful work of his life. He studied the royal cattle for days, sketching them from every angle, memorizing the subtle curve of a spine, the precise angle of a leg. He constructed a frame from light but strong fir wood, building a hollow effigy of a cow, perfectly proportioned and large enough to conceal the queen within. He carved the head with exquisite detail, giving it a placid, lifelike expression. He used polished chips of obsidian for the eyes, which glittered realistically in the light. The true genius of the device was in its verisimilitude. He acquired the hide of a young cow that had recently been slaughtered for the palace kitchens, and he meticulously treated and stretched it over the wooden frame. The hide was so expertly fitted that the seams were invisible, the texture and color a perfect match for the living animals in the pasture. He mounted the entire structure on small, silent wheels, concealed within the hooves, so it could be moved with an eerie smoothness. He even devised a simple system of levers and pivots inside that would allow the occupant to cause the head to nod and the tail to swish, completing the illusion of life. When it was finished, it was a masterpiece of deception, a testament to his unparalleled skill, and a monument to his moral corruption. On the next moonless night, the plan was put into action. Daedalus wheeled the hollow cow out to the secluded royal pastures where the sacred white bull grazed alone. Pasiphae, shrouded in a dark cloak, was already there, her face a pale, determined mask. Without a word exchanged, she climbed a small ladder and slipped into the dark, cramped interior of the wooden effigy. Daedalus secured the hidden panel, his hands slick with sweat. He had done his part. He had built the bridge to this unnatural union. He retreated into the shadows of a nearby olive grove, his heart hammering against his ribs. He watched as the great white bull, which had ignored all the mortal cows, caught the scent of this strange, new arrival. It approached cautiously, its massive head lowered. It circled the wooden cow several times, sniffing at the authentic hide. The The subtle movements, the perfect stillness, the familiar scent, the illusion held. The divine bull was deceived. In the deep silence of the Cretan night, under the indifferent gaze of the stars, Poseidon's horrific, elaborate revenge reached its consummation as the bull mated Minos' wife. Afterward, Pasiphae emerged from the contraption, her body trembling, her face ashen. The fire of the curse had been quenched, but in its place was the cold, dawning horror of what she had done. She returned to the palace, a specter haunted by her own actions. Daedalus, watching her go, was filled with a profound sense of defilement. He had used his God-given talent for creation to facilitate an act of pure degradation. The pride he had once taken in his work now felt like a bitter poison. He was the most famous inventor in the world, yet he had become a secret architect of monstrosities. He had sold his genius for his own security, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that a terrible price would have to be paid. What no one could have seen coming when the queen mated the bull was the sheer, visceral horror of the pregnancy that followed. The fleeting, shameful relief Pasiphae felt in the dark pasture was immediately replaced by a new and more profound terror. In the weeks that followed the unnatural union, the queen's body began to change. Her ailment was no longer a secret psychological torment. It was a physical reality, a monstrous secret growing within her womb. The court physicians were baffled. The queen's condition followed no known pattern of human gestation. She was racked with violent pains and unnatural cravings. The life inside her felt alien, powerful, and hostile. She secluded herself entirely, her chambers becoming a prison cell guarded by her most trusted handmaidens, who were sworn to secrecy on pain of death. King Minos, finally alerted to the gravity of his wife's condition, was consumed by a cold, dreadful suspicion. He knew of the curse, though he had callously ignored his wife's initial suffering. Now he watched her through the lens of his own guilt, seeing Poseidon's final, terrible retribution taking shape. The birth itself was a brutal, bloody affair that took place in the deepest, most secluded chamber of the palace, far from any prying eyes or ears. The creature that emerged was a nightmare made flesh. It was a male infant, but its head was not human. It was the fully formed, monstrous head of a bull calf, covered in fine, downy fur, with small, nub-like horns already protruding from its skull. Its body was that of a human baby, but it was unnaturally large and possessed a strength that was alarming. It did not cry like a human infant. It issued a low, guttural bellow that chilled the souls of the midwives who attended the birth. Pasiphae, upon seeing the thing she had brought into the world, let out a single, soul-shattering scream and fell into a dead faint. The creature was given the name Asterion, or the Starry One, a tragically ironic name for a being destined to live its entire life in darkness. The world, however, would come to know it by a cruder, more direct name, the Minotaur, which simply meant the Bull of Minos. King Minos was summoned. He stood over the stone slab where the creature lay, his face a mask of horrified disbelief. This was his shame, his punishment made manifest. This abomination was the direct result of his own hubris, his broken vow to a god. He saw in the creature's bovine eyes a reflection of his own failure. His first impulse was one of pure, violent rage. He drew his bronze sword, intending to kill the monster then and there, to erase this stain on his family's honor before it could draw another breath. But as he raised the sword, a terrible, paralyzing fear stayed his hand. This was no ordinary monster. It was the offspring of a divine curse and a sacred animal. To kill it might provoke Poseidon's wrath even further. What greater punishment could the god devise than the one already inflicted? Minos, a king who had never known fear, was now terrified of angering the sea god again. He lowered his sword, his mind racing. The creature could not be killed. It had to be hidden. The first few years of the Minotaur's life were a chaotic struggle for containment. Minos had a small suite of rooms in the palace dungeons reinforced with stone and bronze bars, and the creature was locked away, tended to by a rotation of terrified servants. Pasiphae, broken by the ordeal, refused to see or nurse her monstrous child. She became a recluse, wasting away in her chambers, a ghost haunted by the memory of the birth and the low bellows that sometimes echoed up from the palace foundations. The Minotaur grew at an unnatural rate. Within a year, it was the size of a fully grown man, but with the raw, explosive power of a mature bull. Its human body was a mass of thick, corded muscle, and its bull's head was now crowned with a set of long, lethally sharp horns. Its nature was a terrifying hybrid of animal instinct and human cunning. It possessed a bull's aggression and territorial rage, but it also had a cruel, calculating intelligence in its human eyes. It would learn the patterns of the guards, testing the strength of the bars, looking for any sign of weakness. The most horrific discovery, however, was about its diet. The creature refused all food offered to it: grain, fruit, cooked meat. It starved itself for days, its bellows of rage shaking the palace. Then one day, a servant stumbled while delivering a bowl of water, falling against the bars of the cell. In a flash of terrifying speed, the Minotaur reached through the bars, pulled the screaming man into the cell, and devoured him. The truth was revealed. The Minotaur craved human flesh. This discovery plunged Minos into a new level of despair. He now had a man-eating monster in his basement. He began feeding it criminals and prisoners of war, a grim but necessary solution to keep the creature sated and to prevent it from breaking out in a fury of hunger. But the Minotaur's strength continued to grow. There were incidents. On several occasions, it managed to break through its containment. These rampages were swift and brutal. The palace corridors would echo with the sounds of splintering wood, shattering pottery, and the screams of unfortunate servants or guards who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. The creature would rampage until it was cornered and subdued by dozens of the king's elite soldiers, leaving a trail of death and destruction in its wake. Each escape was a closely guarded secret, the bodies of the victims disposed of quietly, the families compensated and sworn to silence. But the fear within the palace was palpable. The staff moved with a constant sense of dread, their ears always listening for the distant roar that signaled another breakout. King Minos knew this situation was unsustainable. The prison was failing. The secret was becoming harder to keep. He was the most powerful king in the Aegean, yet he lived in constant fear of his own stepson. He needed a permanent solution, a prison from which there could be no escape, a place that could hold the monster forever. His mind, desperate for a solution, turned to the one man on Crete whose genius was as boundless as the king's own problem: Daedalus. The summons came late at night. Daedalus was escorted by royal guards not to the throne room but to a small, private council chamber. King Minos was there alone, his face etched with exhaustion and a cold, hard resolve. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He told Daedalus everything. He confessed his broken vow, the curse, the monstrous birth, the creature's diet, the failed attempts at containment. He laid bare the shame and the terror that had been festering at the heart of his kingdom. Daedalus listened in horrified silence. He had, of course, heard the whispers, the rumors of a monster in the palace. But to hear the full, unvarnished truth from the king himself was another matter entirely. He felt a wave of nausea as he realized the central role he himself had played in this tragedy. The wooden cow, his brilliant, shameful creation, had been the key that unlocked this nightmare. He was not an innocent bystander. He was an accomplice. His hands had helped create the vessel that had brought this man-eating abomination into the world. He felt the weight of his own guilt settle upon him, as heavy as a shroud. "I need a prison," Minos said, his voice low and steady, cutting through Daedalus's thoughts. "I need a structure from which this thing can never escape, a place where I can put it and forget that it ever existed. I need a maze so complex, so bewildering, that even its builder would struggle to find his way out. Can you do this for me?" Daedalus looked at the king, at the desperate, dangerous gleam in his eyes, and he knew he had no choice. To refuse would be to admit his own complicity and to incur the full force of the king's wrath. But to accept was to descend even further into moral darkness, to use his God-given talent not just to facilitate a monstrosity, but to build a house for it, to become the architect of a living hell. He would be creating a tomb for the living, a place where men and women would be sent to be devoured. Yet even in his horror, a small, cold part of his mind, the craftsman's part, was intrigued. The problem was one of pure three-dimensional complexity. To design a structure that was intentionally disorienting was an architectural challenge of the highest order. It was the ultimate test of his skill. He saw the winding corridors in his mind, the dead ends, the spiraling staircases that led to nowhere. He saw a building that was a puzzle, a paradox, a physical manifestation of madness. "Yes," Daedalus said, his voice barely a whisper, "I can do it." With that single word, his fate was sealed. Daedalus left the king's council chamber with a weight in his soul that was heavier than any stone he would ever quarry. The royal command was absolute. The task consumed him. He retreated to his workshop, the grand space provided by the king, but it no longer felt like a place of wonder. His mind, once filled with designs for beautiful, life-affirming art, was now a dark chamber of architectural nightmares. The design was a slow, agonizing process of deconstruction. All the principles of architecture he had ever learned, harmony, balance, clarity, flow, had to be inverted. He sought to create a building that was the antithesis of order. He spent weeks studying patterns of chaos in the natural world. He observed the frantic, unpredictable path of a fly caught in a jar. He drew the intricate, overlapping threads of a spider's web. He sketched the disorienting, recursive spiral of a nautilus shell. He studied the way water swirled into a whirlpool, a perfect, inescapable vortex. These were his new muses. He was designing a structure that would weaponize confusion. The labyrinth would not just be a maze of walls, it would be a psychological engine of despair. He decided the labyrinth would be built primarily underground, beneath the foundations of the palace of Knossos itself. This had a practical purpose. It would muffle the sounds of the Minotaur and keep the monstrous secret hidden from the world. It also served a symbolic one. The horror would fester in the darkness, directly beneath the feet of the glittering, sunlit court, a constant, subterranean reminder of the king's sin. The plans called for a central chamber, the Minotaur's den, surrounded by a complex, multi-layered network of passages. There would be no single path. Daedalus designed it with countless forks, loops, and dead ends. Corridors would branch off at odd, unsettling angles. Some passages would gradually narrow, forcing a person to squeeze through, only to open into a small, featureless chamber with no other exit. Others would slope imperceptibly downwards, leading intruders deeper into the earth without them even realizing it. He incorporated optical illusions into the design. Long hallways were built with a slight curve, so the end was never visible from the beginning. He planned for the use of polished stone in certain sections, which would reflect the dim torchlight in confusing patterns, creating phantom movements in the corner of an eye. Light itself would be a tool of confusion. Only a few light wells would penetrate the structure from above, and they were designed to be deep and narrow, casting long, distorted shadows that would dance and shift with the movement of the sun, making it impossible to keep a sense of direction or time. The acoustics were another critical element. The passages were designed to be echo chambers. The Minotaur's guttural roars would be amplified and carried through the entire structure, seeming to come from all directions at once, creating a constant state of terror for anyone trapped within. The sound of one's own footsteps would echo back from unexpected angles, creating the illusion of being followed. Then the construction began. King Minos declared that a new wing of storage cellars was being added to the palace, a plausible cover story that explained the massive excavation. A huge area of land adjacent to the palace dungeons was sectioned off. The workforce was composed primarily of slaves and foreign captives, men whose lives were deemed expendable. These were the men who would dig the labyrinth out of the earth and rock of Crete. Daedalus was given absolute authority over the project. He became a different man. The thoughtful, inspired artist was replaced by a grim, relentless taskmaster. He worked from before sunrise to after sunset, his face perpetually covered in a fine layer of stone dust. his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep and the constant strain of poring over his complex diagrams. He spoke little, and when he did, it was to issue sharp, precise commands. There was no joy in this creation, only a grim, obsessive drive to see it through. The work was brutal and dangerous. The excavation went deep into the earth, requiring complex scaffolding and supports to prevent cave-ins. Men died, crushed by falling rock or lost in the initial, confusing tunnels they themselves had dug. The labyrinthine passages began to take shape, a sprawling, subterranean scar beneath the palace. Massive blocks of limestone were quarried from the Cretan hills, transported by teams of oxen, and lowered into the pit. Daedalus himself directed the placement of every single stone, ensuring the angles were perfect. The corridors twisted exactly as his designs dictated. Bronze doors, heavy and seamless, were forged for key junctions, designed to be opened from one side only. As the structure grew, Daedalus became increasingly isolated. He was the only one who held the complete design in his mind. He would walk the half-finished corridors alone at night, a single torch in his hand, checking the angles, testing the acoustics, feeling the disorienting power of his own creation. Daedalus had constructed the labyrinth so cunningly that he himself could barely escape it after he built it. During these lonely inspections, he would often think of his son, Icarus, who was now a young boy, spending his days playing in the sun, oblivious to the dark world his father was building beneath his feet. Daedalus felt a profound sense of guilt, not just for his complicity in the Minotaur's existence, but for the dark legacy he was now cementing into the very earth of Crete. He was creating a monument to fear, and he was doing it with the same hands that had once crafted toys for his son. After more than a year of relentless work, the labyrinth was complete. The final task was to move the Minotaur into its new home. This was a military operation. The creature was now fully grown, a terrifying behemoth of muscle and rage. Minos ordered his most elite palace guards to handle the transfer. They were armed with heavy bronze shields, long spears, and thick leather nets. They starved the Minotaur for 3 days then. A trail of freshly slaughtered goats was laid from its dungeon to the newly constructed entrance of the labyrinth. Daedalus had to lead the operation. He was the only one who knew the safe path to the center. He had designed a specific linear route for this one occasion, a path that could be sealed off behind them as they progressed. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood before the great bronze door of the labyrinth entrance. The Minotaur, driven by a ravenous hunger, burst from its dungeon and began to follow the bloody trail. The guards formed a moving wall behind it, their spears pointed, ready to drive it forward if it hesitated. The creature was a terrifying sight. It was over 7 feet tall, its human torso rippling with muscle, its massive bull's head swinging from side to side, its nostrils flaring as it scented the blood. Daedalus led them into the darkness. The air immediately grew cold and damp. The only light came from the torches of the guards, which cast long, flickering shadows down the endless corridors. As soon as they passed through a section, a team of masons would seal the passage behind them with pre-cut stone blocks and quick-setting mortar. There would be no retreat. They moved deeper into the maze, the Minotaur's heavy hooves echoing on the stone floor. The creature seemed to grow more agitated as they went deeper, the disorienting angles and endless turns affecting its animal senses. It would periodically stop and let out a deafening roar, a sound that was amplified and distorted by the labyrinth's acoustics until it seemed to be coming from the very walls around them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the central chamber. Daedalus and the guards slipped through a narrow, pre-planned exit on the far side of the chamber. A massive, counterweighted stone door which Daedalus had designed himself was released. It slid shut with a deafening boom that echoed through the entire structure. A series of heavy bronze bolts, thrown by a mechanism from the outside, slammed into place. The Minotaur was trapped. The sudden silence that followed was more unnerving than the roars had been. It was the silence of a tomb. King Minos was waiting for them at the labyrinth's entrance. When Daedalus emerged, covered in dust and sweat, his face pale, the king did not offer a word of thanks. He simply nodded, his face a mixture of relief and grim satisfaction. The king's shame was now entombed. The labyrinth was immediately sealed, its entrance covered over and disguised. What Daedalus did not know after locking up the Minotaur is how the creature's containment would initiate a new, far-reaching chapter of horror. He had solved King Minos's immediate problem, entombing the royal shame in a subterranean fortress of his own design. Perhaps in the immediate aftermath, Daedalus felt a grim sense of finality, a belief that the monster was now a secret that would remain buried forever. He was wrong. The Minotaur was not just a family secret. It was about to become the most feared political weapon in the Aegean. The story of the Minotaur's hunger was about to become interwoven with the fate of Daedalus's own homeland, the city of Athens, transforming his architectural masterpiece into an altar for human sacrifice. The origin of this cruel tradition lay in a tragedy that had occurred years earlier, a story of athletic triumph and murderous jealousy that had set Athens and Crete on a collision course. You see, King Minos had a son named Androgeos, a young man who embodied the Cretan ideal. He was strong, handsome, and exceptionally gifted in all athletic pursuits. Androgeos traveled to Athens to compete in the Panathenaic Games, a grand festival held in honor of the goddess Athena. To the shock and dismay of the Athenians, the Cretan prince dominated the competition. He won event after event, effortlessly defeating Athens' finest athletes and claiming every prize. The Athenian crowds, who had gathered to celebrate their own champions, were forced to watch a foreigner take all the glory. Their cheers turned to resentful silence, and admiration soured into a bitter, collective envy. King Aegeus of Athens, a weak and insecure ruler, was deeply embarrassed by his city's poor showing. The whispers of the disgruntled nobles and the sullen mood of the populace pressured him to act. The myth offers two accounts of what happened next, each as treacherous as the other. In one version, Aegeus, consumed by jealousy over Androgeos' victories, arranged for the Cretan prince to be ambushed and murdered on the road to Thebes, where he was heading to compete in another festival. In the second, more duplicitous version, Aegeus saw an opportunity to solve two problems at once. The region of Marathon near Athens was being terrorized by a massive, fire-breathing bull, the very same Marathonian bull that Heracles had captured as one of his labors and then released. Aegeus, under the guise of offering Androgeos a final, ultimate challenge worthy of his skill, sent the young prince to hunt and kill the beast. It was, of course, a suicide mission. Androgeos, ever the brave competitor, accepted the challenge and was gored to death by the ferocious animal. When news of his son's murder reached King Minos, his grief was surpassed only by his rage. His beloved son, his heir, had been killed through the treachery of the Athenians. The king of Crete was not a man to suffer such an insult. He was a son of Zeus, the ruler of a maritime empire, and his vengeance would be absolute. He gathered his fleet, the most powerful naval force in the world, and set sail for Athens. The war was swift and brutal. The Athenian army was no match for the seasoned Cretan warriors, and Minos's fleet established a complete blockade of the city, cutting off all trade and food supplies. Minos laid siege to Athens, but he did not order an immediate assault. He had a more powerful ally on his side. He stood before the city walls and prayed to his father, Zeus, asking for a sign of divine justice against the city that had murdered his son. The sky god answered. A devastating plague descended upon Athens. The city was ravaged by a sickness that filled the streets with the dead and dying. Famine followed, as the city's food stores dwindled under the blockade. The people of Athens were trapped, starving, and dying of disease. King Aegeus, seeing his city brought to its knees, knew he had no choice. He sent an envoy to King Minos, begging for terms of surrender. Minos's terms were cruel and designed for maximum humiliation. Athens would be spared from complete destruction. The Cretan army would withdraw. The plague would be lifted. In return, Athens would pay a blood price for the death of Androgeos. The nature of this tribute was horrific, as every 9 years, on the anniversary of Minos's victory, the city of Athens was required to send a tribute of its finest citizens to Crete. This tribute would consist of 7 of its most courageous young men and 7 of its most beautiful young women. These 14 youths were not to be slaves but offerings. They were to be sacrificed to the Minotaur. The first collection of the tribute was a moment of profound sorrow for Athens. The city, already weakened by war and plague, was now forced to endure this final degradation. The 14 youths were chosen by a lottery, a terrible spectacle where the fate of a family's child was decided by the drawing of a marked stone. The wails of mothers and fathers echoed through the city as their children were led away. The chosen youths, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and defiant pride, were marched to the port and placed on a ship with a single black sail, a symbol of the hopeless, funereal nature of their journey. When the ship arrived in Crete, Daedalus was forced to witness the grim reality of his creation. He watched as the 14 young Athenians were paraded through the streets of Knossos before being taken to the hidden entrance of the labyrinth. His guilt, which had been a constant, low hum in the background of his life, now became a deafening roar. He heard the great stone door of the labyrinth roll shut, and he imagined the terror of the youths as they were plunged into the disorienting darkness. He imagined their panic search for an exit, their growing exhaustion, the moment they would hear the first guttural roar of the Minotaur echoing through the passages. He imagined their final, terrifying moments. The weight of this knowledge was almost unbearable. He retreated to his workshop, but he could find no solace in his work. Every tool he picked up felt tainted. He looked at his own son, Icarus, who was now growing into a strong, vibrant boy, and he saw the faces of the Athenian victims. He was raising a son in a palace that fed on the children of his own people. 9 years passed. For Crete, it was a period of continued prosperity. The families of the first victims mourned, and all other families prayed that the lottery would not choose them next. For Daedalus, it was 9 years of a gilded imprisonment. His complicity in the labyrinth bound him to the king with chains of shared guilt. Then the second tribute came due. Again, the ship with the black sail arrived in Athens. Again, the lottery was held. Again, 14 more young lives were chosen to be extinguished in the dark corridors of the labyrinth. Daedalus once more watched the grim procession. The horror was no longer new. It was now a routine, a recurring nightmare that had become a part of the political landscape. The sight of the second group of victims deepened his despair. Another 9 years crawled by. The tribute had now been paid twice. 28 young Athenians had been sacrificed to the Minotaur. The horror had become a tradition. In Athens, a whole generation had grown up under the shadow of the tribute. The name of King Minos was a curse. The resentment against Crete had festered, growing into a deep, burning hatred. The people of Athens prayed for a hero, someone who could break the cycle of tribute and restore their city's honor. In Crete, Daedalus watched his son Icarus grow into a young man. He was now the same age as the victims who were being sent to their deaths. Every time Daedalus looked at Icarus, with his bright eyes and his adventurous spirit, he felt a fresh stab of guilt and fear. He saw in his own son the potential and the life that were being stolen from the Athenian youths. He began to think more seriously about escape. He would study the guards' patrols, the schedules of the ships in the harbor, the geography of the island. But Minos's control was absolute. The island was a fortress. Escape by land or by sea seemed impossible. As the 27th year since the war drew to a close, the third tribute was being prepared, and with it would come an unexpected hero. Prince Theseus was as noble as they come, and he would not stand by while his city suffered under a yoke of fear and humiliation. He was a new kind of hero for Athens, a man whose strength was matched by his sharp intellect and his profound sense of justice. He had grown up in the shadow of the Cretan tribute, a dark story whispered in the nurseries and lamented in the public squares. Theseus had seen the grief that tore through families. He had felt the simmering rage and helplessness that permeated Athenian society. He saw the tribute for what it was, an instrument of terror designed to keep Athens perpetually on its knees before the might of King Minos. As he came into his manhood, a cold, hard resolve formed in his heart. He would not let it happen again. Theseus's own origins were steeped in myth and destiny. His mother was Aethra, the princess of Troezen. His father was officially Aegeus, the king of Athens. Before Aegeus had left Troezen, he had placed his sword and sandals under a massive boulder and told Aethra that if their son was strong enough to lift the stone and retrieve the items, he should come to Athens and claim his birthright. Some whispers, however, suggested that on the very same night Aegeus lay with Aethra, the sea god Poseidon had also visited her. This dual parentage would explain Theseus's incredible strength and his deep connection to the sea. He grew up in Troezen, raised by his mother and grandfather, and proved his heroic nature early on. When he was old enough, he easily lifted the great stone, claimed his father's tokens, and set out for Athens. He chose to travel by the dangerous land route along the coast, a path infested with bandits and monsters. He sought out danger, eager to prove his worth and make the world a safer place. He defeated Periphetes, the club-bearer, Cines, the pine-bender, Sciron, who kicked travelers off a cliff to be eaten by a giant turtle, and Procrustes, the twisted innkeeper who would stretch or cut his guests to fit his bed. He arrived in Athens as a celebrated hero, a protector of the people. He found his father, King Aegeus, old, frail, and living in fear. The court was under the sway of the sorceress Medea, who saw the newly arrived hero as a threat to her own influence. She tried to poison Theseus, but at the last moment, Aegeus recognized the sword at the young man's hip, the very sword he had left under the stone, and knocked the poisoned cup from his hand. Medea fled, and Theseus was joyfully embraced and proclaimed as the heir to the Athenian throne. He quickly became a beloved figure in the city, his presence a source of hope and pride. But the dark cloud of the Cretan tribute still hung over them. As the time for the third tribute approached, a palpable dread fell over the city. The lottery was announced, and the process of selecting the 14 victims began. Theseus watched as the names were drawn, as families were torn apart by grief. He could not bear it. He went before his father and the assembled elders of Athens and made a stunning announcement. He would go to Crete. He would volunteer to be one of the 7 young men. This was not a suicide mission, he explained. He would not go as a sacrificial lamb. He would go as a champion. He would enter the labyrinth, he would slay the Minotaur, and he would end the tribute forever. A wave of shock and disbelief swept through the throne room. King Aegeus was horrified. He clutched at his son, his old eyes filled with tears, and begged him not to go. He was the king's only son, the future of Athens. To risk his life in such a reckless venture was madness. Theseus remained resolute. He argued that a prince who hid in his palace while his people were sent to their deaths was no prince at all. He believed it was his destiny, the very reason the gods had given him his strength. He argued that true leadership required sacrifice, and true honor could only be won by confronting evil directly. His passionate words and unwavering confidence stirred the hearts of the Athenian people. They saw in him a true hero, a king worthy of their loyalty. Reluctantly, his heart heavy with a father's fear, Aegeus gave his consent. The departure was a somber affair. As Theseus prepared to board the ship, his father made one final, desperate plea. He pointed to the ship's sail, which was, by tradition, dyed a deep black to signify the funereal nature of the voyage. "My son," Aegeus said, his voice trembling, "I will watch for your return every day from the cliffs of Saunion. If the gods grant you victory, if you are successful in your quest, I beg you, do not forget this one thing. Take down this black sail and hoist a white one in its place. Let the white sail be the first sign to me that you are alive and victorious. If I see the black sail on the horizon, I will know that you have failed, and my old heart will break." Theseus embraced his father and promised he would not forget. He boarded the ship with the other 13 tributes, a group of terrified youths who now looked to him as their only hope. Their arrival at the port of Knossos was a spectacle of power and humiliation, just as Minos had designed. The Cretan harbor was a bustling hub of commerce, filled with ships from Egypt, the Levant, and across the Aegean. The Athenians' small ship, with its single black sail, looked insignificant and pathetic amidst the grandeur of the Cretan fleet. As the tributes disembarked, they were met by a contingent of royal guards in gleaming bronze armor. They were chained together and marched through the streets of the city toward the palace. The people of Knossos lined the streets to watch the procession. Some jeered and threw refuse at the Athenians, seeing them as the children of a defeated enemy. Others watched in silence, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They knew where these young people were going. In his workshop high in the palace, Daedalus heard the commotion. He went to a window that overlooked the main processional way. He saw the grim parade, the 14 young Athenians, their heads held high despite the chains, being led toward the palace. His heart constricted in his chest. These were the children of his city. He scanned their faces, and for a terrifying moment, he imagined he saw Icarus among them. He felt a wave of self-loathing so profound it almost buckled his knees. This was the result of his work. As he watched, his eyes fell upon the young man at the front of the procession. He was taller than the others, and he walked with a confidence that bordered on defiance. He met the gaze of the jeering crowd not with fear, but with a cool, challenging stare. The tributes were brought into the great throne room of the Palace of Knossos. The hall was vast, its high ceiling supported by massive red columns, its walls covered in vibrant frescoes of bull leapers and griffins. King Minos sat on a magnificent throne of carved stone, flanked by his royal guards. He looked down at the 14 chained youths with an expression of cold, imperial disdain. His eyes immediately found Theseus. "So," Minos said, his voice echoing in the cavernous hall, "the son of Aegeus honors my court. I am surprised. I had thought the royal blood of Athens was too precious to be spilled for the sake of a broken treaty." "I am here as an Athenian, not as a prince," Theseus replied, his voice clear and steady. "I have come to pay my city's tribute, but I have also come to put an end to it." A ripple of surprise went through the Cretan court. Minos leaned forward, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. "Brave words for a boy in chains. You think you can succeed where all others have failed. You think you can best the beast that even my finest soldiers fear. The labyrinth does not give up its secrets, and the Minotaur does not give up its meals." "I will face your beast," Theseus said, "and I will emerge victorious. This I swear." At that moment, a movement at the side of the throne room caught Theseus's eye. A young woman was standing there, partially hidden behind a column. She was dressed in the fine, colorful robes of the Cretan nobility. It was Princess Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos. Minos, amused by Theseus's bravado, made a show of royal magnanimity. He ordered the guards to treat the Athenian prince with a measure of respect. Theseus and the other tributes were not thrown into a common dungeon. They were given comfortable quarters and a final, lavish meal. It was a cat-and-mouse game, a psychological torment designed to break their spirits before they were thrown to the monster. When Princess Ariadne first saw the heroic Theseus, she felt an immediate and profound attraction. She had stood, partially concealed behind a massive red column in the great throne room, and watched the confrontation between her father and the Athenian prince. She had seen countless captives brought before her father's throne over the years. She had seen proud warriors, defeated kings, and terrified slaves. They all had one thing in common: fear. Their eyes were always downcast, their bodies trembled, and their voices were barely whispers. Theseus was different. He stood in chains, yet he showed no fear. He met her father's cold, arrogant gaze with a steady, defiant fire of his own. His voice was strong and clear, his words filled with a courage that bordered on reckless. She knew instantly that she loved him. Ariadne's life, for all its luxury, was an empty one. She was a princess in a gilded cage, her days filled with weaving, dancing, and religious ceremonies. She was surrounded by the dark secrets of her family. She knew the truth about her mother, Pasiphae, who now lived as a recluse, a ghost haunted by the memory of her divine curse. She knew the truth about the creature in the labyrinth, the monstrous result of that curse, her own half-brother. She had grown up hearing its distant roars echoing from beneath the palace, a sound that terrified the servants but had become a grim, familiar part of her life. She knew the truth about the Athenian tribute, the gruesome ritual that her father presented as a necessary sacrifice, but was, in reality, a brutal exercise in political dominance. A deep sense of shame and revulsion had taken root in her heart. She despised the monster, and she despised the fear that her father used as his primary tool of governance. She saw the cruelty and the injustice of it all, but as a princess, she was powerless to change it. Theseus represented a chance for that to change. He was not just a handsome hero who had captured her infatuation. He was a force of disruption that could potentially shatter the grim status quo of her father's reign. To help him was a terrifying prospect. It would mean betraying her father, her kingdom, and everything she had ever known. If she were caught, her father's wrath would be terrible. Minos was not a man who tolerated dissent, especially from within his own family. She could be imprisoned, exiled, or even executed. Yet, the thought of doing nothing, of standing by while this courageous hero and 13 other innocent people were sent to their deaths, was even more unbearable. Her conscience warred with her fear. Her desire for a better, more just world fought against her instinct for self-preservation. That night, as Theseus and the other tributes were being held in their quarters, awaiting their doom, Ariadne made her decision. She would act. She knew that courage and strength alone would not be enough to defeat the labyrinth. The maze itself was as deadly as the monster. Her father had often boasted that its creator, the genius Daedalus, was the only man alive who knew its secrets. And so, under the cover of darkness, her face veiled, Ariadne made her way to the one person in the palace who might be able to help her, Daedalus. She found the old inventor in his workshop, working late into the night. Daedalus had aged considerably since the completion of the labyrinth. His shoulders were stooped, and his eyes held a permanent sadness. He looked up, surprised and wary, as the princess entered. Ariadne did not waste time with courtly pleasantries. She told him directly of her intention to help the Athenian prince. She spoke with a passion and a conviction that reminded Daedalus of another young, ambitious royal who had once come to him for help, her mother, Pasiphae. He felt a chill run down his spine. He had learned the hard way what happened when he involved himself in the secret affairs of the royal family. His first instinct was to refuse, to send the princess away, and to pretend this conversation had never happened. But Ariadne was persuasive. She appealed not to his fear, but to his conscience. "You built this place," she said, her voice a fierce whisper. "You know its secrets. You know what it is used for. The blood of every Athenian who has died in there is on your hands as well as my father's. Here is a chance to undo some of the evil you have helped to create. Here is a chance for redemption." Her words struck Daedalus like a physical blow. Redemption. It was a concept he had long since abandoned. He had resigned himself to his guilt, to his role as the architect of horror. But seeing this young princess so full of righteous fire, he felt a flicker of something he had not felt in decades: hope. He saw an opportunity to atone for his past sins. He explained to Ariadne that killing the Minotaur was only half the battle. The true challenge was escaping the labyrinth afterwards. It was designed to psychologically break a person, to turn them around until all sense of direction was lost. He explained that a simple map would be useless. The labyrinth was designed to defy logical navigation. "There is only one way," he explained. "The solution is not to find a path, but to make one." He went to a chest where he kept his supplies and pulled out a simple ball of linen thread. He explained the plan. Theseus must tie one end of the thread to the entrance of the labyrinth. As he walked, he must let the thread unspool behind him, creating a continuous physical line that he could follow back to the start. Ariadne took the items, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. That same night, she arranged a secret meeting with Theseus. She explained the plan, pressing the ball of thread into his hands. She described the nature of the labyrinth, repeating Daedalus's warnings. She told him of the disorienting corridors, the dead ends, the psychological traps. She made him promise that if he was successful, he would take her with him when he escaped from Crete. She could not remain in her father's court after such a betrayal. She would be a fugitive just like him. Theseus, moved by her bravery and intelligence, readily agreed. He looked at her, not just as a princess or an ally, but as a kindred spirit. He swore an oath that he would not leave Crete without her. Their fates were now bound together. The next morning, the ceremony of the tribute began. The 14 Athenian youths were led from their quarters. The palace court assembled to watch the spectacle. King Minos presided, his face a mask of solemn authority. The hidden entrance to the labyrinth was opened, revealing a dark, descending staircase. The other 13 tributes were trembling, some openly weeping. Theseus, however, was calm. He gave a final, reassuring nod to his companions. As he was led to the entrance, he surreptitiously tied the end of Ariadne's thread to the lintel of the door, letting the ball drop into the darkness ahead. He took a final look at the sky, at Ariadne, whose face was a pale oval in the crowd, and then he descended into the labyrinth. The great stone door boomed shut behind him, plunging the world into absolute darkness and silence. For the 13 Athenian tributes now trapped inside, panic began to set in. Several of the young women stifled sobs, while the young men, who had tried to maintain a stoic facade, could be heard breathing in ragged, fearful gasps. They were in the belly of the beast, a place from which no one had ever returned. Theseus, however, was a beacon of calm in the rising tide of fear. He had prepared for this moment. "Stay close to me," he commanded. "Hold on to the person in front of you. We will move as one." He took his place at the front of the line, the other 13 youths forming a human chain behind him, their hands gripping each other's tunics with a desperate strength. He began the descent. They would walk for what felt like an eternity in a straight line, only to have the passage make a sudden, sharp turn. Sometimes the floor would slope gently downwards, leading them deeper into the earth, while at other times it would rise, giving them the false hope that they were heading back towards the surface. As they moved deeper, they began to see the gruesome evidence of those who had come before them. The labyrinth was a graveyard. In the corners of some chambers, they would stumble upon piles of bones, some of them picked clean, others still with scraps of clothing clinging to them. They saw the skulls of the victims from the previous tributes, their eye sockets empty, their jaws frozen in silent screams. One of the Athenian maidens fainted at the sight and had to be carried. The reality of their situation, the brutal, violent end that awaited them, was now undeniable. This was a slaughterhouse. And then they heard it for the first time, a low, guttural roar that seemed to come from the very stones around them. It was a sound of pure, animalistic rage, and it was close. The tributes froze, their bodies rigid with terror. Theseus drew his sword, its bronze blade a faint gleam in the oppressive dark. He stood perfectly still, listening, trying to pinpoint the direction of the sound. But the labyrinth's acoustics were too deceptive. The roar echoed and bounced off the walls, making it impossible to locate its source. They pressed on, their pace quickening. The stench was growing stronger, the air heavier. The thread, their only guide, led them down a spiraling staircase that seemed to descend into the very bowels of the earth. At the bottom, it opened into a vast chamber, the largest they had yet encountered. This was it. This was the heart of the Laris. The floor was a carpet of bones, and the walls were scored with deep gouges, as if a giant, enraged animal had been clawing at the stone for centuries. The air was thick with the foul smell of the Minotaur's lair. And there, in the center of the chamber, it stood. The Minotaur was a creature of nightmare. Its head was the massive, shaggy head of a bull, with a pair of long, wickedly sharp horns that curved forward. Its eyes glowed with a feral, red light in the darkness, and its hot, ragged breath came in steaming snorts from its flared nostrils. It was not just an animal. There was a cruel intelligence in its eyes, a malevolent awareness that was far more terrifying than simple bestial rage. It had been waiting for them. The Minotaur let out another deafening roar, a sound of pure, bloodthirsty triumph, and charged. Theseus shoved the other tributes back towards the staircase. "Stay back," he yelled. He stood his ground, his sword held ready. The creature was unbelievably fast for its size. It lowered its head, its horns aimed at Theseus's chest. At the last possible second, Theseus sidestepped, the horns missing him by inches and gouging a deep scar in the stone wall behind him. The force of the impact shook the chamber. The battle was a brutal primal dance of death. Theseus was quick and agile, but the Minotaur's strength was overwhelming. It did not fight like a man. It fought like a force of nature. It would charge, and Theseus would have to dodge, using the monster's own momentum against it. It would swing its massive, human-like fists, blows that could shatter stone, and Theseus would have to duck and weave. He tried to get in close to use his sword, but the creature's reach was too great, and its horns created a deadly perimeter. The fight was a grueling test of endurance. Theseus was drenched in sweat, his muscles burning, his lungs gasping for air in the foul atmosphere of the chamber. The roars of the Minotaur were deafening, a constant assault on his senses. He realized that a direct confrontation was suicide. He had to use his intellect, the one advantage he had. He began to use the chamber itself as a weapon. He would feint one way, causing the Minotaur to charge and crash into a wall. He would lead it on a chase around the chamber, tiring it out, forcing the massive creature to expend its seemingly limitless energy. The Minotaur grew more and more enraged. It was used to terrified, fleeing victims, not a warrior who would fight back. Its roars of triumph turned to bellows of frustration. Finally, Theseus saw his opening. After a particularly violent charge, the Minotaur's horn became briefly lodged in a fissure in the stone wall. The creature was stuck for a precious second, its head twisted at an awkward angle, its thick neck exposed. Theseus did not hesitate. He lunged forward, not with his sword, but with his bare hands. He grabbed the Minotaur by its horns, his feet braced against the wall. With a surge of adrenaline and a prayer to his father, Poseidon, he used all of his legendary strength. He twisted the creature's head with a violent, wrenching motion. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the Minotaur let out a final, gurgling bellow. Its massive body went limp, and it crashed to the floor, its head bent at an impossible angle. The beast was dead. A profound silence fell over the chamber. Theseus stood over the body of the fallen monster, his chest heaving, his body bruised and battered but victorious. The reign of terror was over. He retrieved his sword and turned to the staircase where the other tributes were huddled, their faces a mixture of terror and awe. "It is done," he said, his voice hoarse. "The monster is dead." Theseus went to the wall where the thread was still secured. He picked it up. It felt like the most precious object in the world. "Now," he said, "we go home." He led them back the way they came, their roles now reversed. He was no longer leading them to their doom, but to their salvation. He followed the thread with a meticulous, painstaking focus. Every turn, every junction, every staircase was navigated by the simple, unwavering line of Ariadne's thread. The journey back felt even longer than the journey in. Their exhaustion was profound, and the darkness seemed to press in on them even more. After what seemed like an eternity, they saw a faint glimmer of light in the distance. It was the entrance. They began to run, their exhaustion forgot. They scrambled up the final flight of stairs and burst out into the Cretan sunlight. They were alive. They were free. They fell to the ground, weeping with a joy and relief so profound it was painful. Ariadne was waiting for them, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and exultation. She had kept her vigil, praying to the gods for his success. When she saw Theseus emerge from the darkness, alive and victorious, she ran to him. The triumphant emergence of Theseus and the Athenian tributes from the labyrinth sent a shockwave of disbelief through the palace of Knossos. The impossible had happened. The monster was dead and the maze had been defeated. For a brief, stunned moment, there was chaos. Princess Ariadne, her face pale but her eyes shining with triumph, rushed to Theseus's side. The pact had been fulfilled. The hero had been victorious. But their victory had shattered the foundations of King Minos's power, and his retribution would be swift and terrible. Ariadne knew they had to act immediately. Her father's shock would quickly turn to rage, and that rage would be directed at everyone involved in this grand betrayal. She had already made preparations. She led Theseus and the other 13 Athenians through a series of lesser-used service corridors in the palace, avoiding the main halls where the royal guards would be massing. They moved quickly and silently, a small band of fugitives in the heart of an enemy stronghold. Their destination was the harbor. Ariadne, using her authority as a princess, had already ensured that the Athenian ship, the one with the black sail, was supplied and ready to depart at a moment's notice. The escape from the palace was a tense, nerve-wracking affair. At any moment they could have been discovered, but the palace was in a state of confusion. The news of the Minotaur's death was spreading like wildfire, and the chain of command had momentarily broken down. They reached the harbor without incident. The Athenian ship was waiting, its crew ready. Theseus and his 13 companions, along with Princess Ariadne, scrambled aboard. As they cast off the mooring ropes and began to row out of the harbor, the first alarm bells began to ring from the palace. The escape had been discovered. But Ariadne had one final, brilliant trick up her sleeve, a detail provided by the ever-practical Daedalus. Before they fled the palace, she had instructed a few loyal servants to go to the Cretan naval yards. Under the cover of the confusion, they had bored holes in the hulls of the Cretan warships, scuttling the fleet at its moorings. When King Minos, his face purple with rage, gave the order to launch his ships in pursuit, he was met with the devastating news that his mighty navy was taking on water and unable to sail. This act of sabotage bought the Athenians the precious time they needed. By the time the Cretan ships could be repaired, the small Athenian vessel would be long gone, lost on the vast expanse of the Aegean. As the shores of Crete faded into the distance, a sense of euphoria filled the Athenian ship. They had done it. They had faced the monster, defeated the labyrinth, and escaped the clutches of the most powerful king in the world. They were heroes, returning to their city as conquerors. Theseus and Ariadne stood at the prow of the ship, the sea wind in their hair. Their gamble had paid off. They were together and they were free. Their journey home, however, would be marked by a series of strange and tragic events, as if the gods themselves were not yet finished with them. Their first stop was the island of Dia, which is now known as Naxos. They put ashore to take on fresh water and to allow the exhausted crew and tributes to rest. They held a celebration on the beach that night, a joyous festival to honor their victory. They feasted, they drank, and they danced. Theseus, in a moment of inspiration, created a new dance, a complex, winding pattern of steps that mimicked the twisting corridors of the labyrinth. This dance, known as the crane dance, would become a tradition, performed for centuries to commemorate their escape. That night, under the stars, Theseus and Ariadne consummated their love, their union a symbol of the new alliance between Athens and the spirit of rebellion against tyranny. But their happiness was to be short-lived. The next morning, when Ariadne awoke on the beach, she was alone. The Athenian ship was gone, a mere speck on the horizon. Theseus had abandoned her. The reasons for this cruel act are one of the great mysteries of Greek mythology. Some versions of the story say that Theseus was simply a callous, ambitious man who had used Ariadne to achieve his goals, and then discarded her when she was no longer useful. He knew that returning to Athens with the daughter of his enemy could create political complications, and he chose his ambition over his love. Other, more sympathetic versions claim that he was visited in a dream by the god Dionysus, who informed Theseus that Ariadne was destined to be his bride, and that the hero must leave her on the island for him. In this telling, Theseus left her with a heavy heart, a mortal man forced to bow to the will of a god. A third version states that it was the goddess Athena who appeared to him, ordering him to leave Ariadne behind, as her presence in Athens would bring ill fortune. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Ariadne was left heartbroken and alone on a deserted island, betrayed by the man for whom she had sacrificed everything. As Theseus sailed on towards Athens, his mind was so consumed by thoughts of his impending heroic welcome, or perhaps by his guilt over abandoning Ariadne, that he forgot the one crucial promise he had made to his father. He forgot to change the sail. The ship continued on its course, the black sail, the symbol of death and despair, still flying from its mast. In Athens, King Aegeus had been keeping a constant vigil. Every day from sunrise to sunset, the old king would go to the high cliffs of Cape Saunion, the southernmost point of Attica, and stare out at the sea, his old eyes straining to see the first glimpse of his son's returning ship. Weeks had passed and his hope had begun to fade. He feared the worst. Then one day he saw it, a ship on the horizon, its silhouette matching that of the Athenian vessel. His heart soared with a desperate hope. He squinted, his hand shielding his eyes from the glare of the sun, praying to see a flash of white. But the sail was not white, it was black. The sight of the black sail was a death blow to the old king's fragile heart. He was overcome with a grief so profound, so absolute, that he could not bear to live another moment. Believing his only son to be dead, devoured by the Minotaur, his heroic quest a failure, King Aegeus threw himself from the high cliffs into the sea below. The body of water into which he fell would forever after be named in his honor, the Aegean Sea. When Theseus finally arrived at the port of Athens, he was met not with the joyous celebration he had expected, but with the news of his father's tragic death. His triumphant return was forever tainted by the sorrow of his own careless mistake. He had saved 13 lives, but he had cost his father his. He was now the king of Athens, but his reign began with a funeral. Back in Crete, King Minos's rage had solidified into a cold, calculating fury. His stepson was dead, his daughter was a traitor, his navy was crippled, and his authority had been openly defied. He ordered his palace guards to find everyone responsible. While Theseus and Ariadne were gone, the architect of the escape was still within his grasp. Minos knew that Theseus could not have navigated the labyrinth alone. The intricate plan was too perfect, too knowledgeable. It had the mark of Daedalus all over it. The inventor was the only one who knew the labyrinth's fatal secret. This was the ultimate betrayal. The man he had taken in, the man he had showered with wealth and honor, had turned against him and orchestrated his greatest humiliation. The royal guards, their bronze armor glinting in the Cretan sun, stormed Daedalus's workshop. They found the old inventor sitting calmly amidst his tools and unfinished projects, as if he had been expecting them. With him was his son, Icarus, now a young man on the cusp of adulthood, his face a mixture of fear and confusion. They were arrested without a fight. Daedalus knew there was no point in resisting. His battle had already been fought and lost. They were dragged before King Minos, whose fury was a cold, quiet thing that was far more terrifying than any outburst. He sat on his throne, his eyes like chips of obsidian, and he looked at Daedalus with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He accused him of being the mastermind behind the escape, of giving Ariadne the secrets of the labyrinth, of conspiring with the enemies of Crete. Daedalus, his hands bound behind his back, did not deny it. He simply met the king's gaze, his own eyes filled with a weary resignation. He had made his choice. He had sided with justice over tyranny, and he was prepared to face the consequences. Minos's punishment was swift and cruel. He would not execute Daedalus. That would be too merciful. Instead, Daedalus and Icarus were taken to a high, isolated stone tower on the coast, a prison from which escape would be impossible. The tower was a bleak and lonely place, but from its single barred window, they had a perfect, agonizing view of the open sea and the endless sky, a constant reminder of the freedom they had lost. The days in the tower were a monotonous torment. For Icarus, the confinement was a living death. He paced the small cell like a caged animal, his youthful energy turning into a bitter restlessness. He would spend hours staring out at the sea, watching the birds soar on the wind, his heart aching with a desperate yearning for freedom. Daedalus watched his son's spirit wither, and his own despair began to transform into a fierce resolve. He would not let his son waste away in this prison. He began to study their confinement with an engineer's eye, analyzing the guards' routines, the structure of the tower, and the natural world outside their window. As Daedalus was watching outside the tower window, he noted birds and how they seemed to own the sky. He saw how the gulls would hang, almost motionless, on the updrafts rising from the cliffs, their wings spread wide to catch the invisible currents. He observed the kestrels, how they would hover in one spot, their wings beating in a rapid, precise rhythm, before diving with breathtaking speed. He watched the eagles, how they would circle high above, their great wings barely moving as they rode the thermal columns, their vision scanning the earth below. To Daedalus, a man whose mind was a machine for deconstructing and understanding the world, the birds were not just a symbol of the freedom he had lost. They were a living blueprint, a technical manual for escape. The thought, at first a flicker of mad inspiration, began to solidify into a concrete and audacious plan. He would not break out of his prison. He would fly out of it. The project began with a desperate, methodical scavenger hunt. Their prison tower, a place of deprivation, had to become his new workshop, and its meager contents his raw materials. The most crucial component was feathers, and lots of them. He instructed his son, Icarus, to become a hunter of feathers. The boy, his youthful energy now focused on this thrilling, secret purpose, spent his days diligently searching. He would gather the feathers that the gulls and pigeons left on their window ledge. He would use a long, thin stick with a dab of sticky pitch on the end to snag feathers that had become caught in the crevices of the stone walls. Every feather was a treasure, from the small, soft, downy feathers to the long, stiff, primary flight feathers. They amassed a growing pile of them, hidden under a loose stone in the floor of their cell. The next essential ingredient was an adhesive to bind the feathers together. Daedalus knew that only beeswax would have the right combination of stickiness and malleability, but wax was a luxury they did not have. Daedalus had to resort to a game of subtle manipulation and bribery with their guards. He was still the great Daedalus, and his fame was a currency he could still spend. He would take the wooden bowls from their meals, and using a sharpened stone, he would carve intricate figures on them. A leaping dolphin, a charging bull, the face of a beautiful woman. He would give these small works of art to the guards, who were awed by his skill. In return, he would ask for small favors, a little extra bread, a new wineskin, and most importantly, small lumps of beeswax, which the guards used to seal messages. The guards, seeing no harm in it, would occasionally oblige, and Daedalus slowly, painstakingly, built up his supply of wax. The final components were a frame and a harness. He needed wood for the frame, something light but strong. He managed to acquire it by breaking down the wooden stools in their cell, claiming they were broken. For the harness, he used the leather straps from their own sandals and cut strips from the spare tunics they were given. He unraveled the hems of his own clothes, painstakingly pulling out the strong linen threads one by one. His prison cell was slowly, secretly, being deconstructed and repurposed for his grand design. He took a deep breath and he leaped. For a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, he plummeted. The wind shrieked past his ears. He was a stone falling from a great height. But then, instinctively, he began to beat his arms, his great wings catching the air. He felt a sudden, miraculous lift. His fall slowed, stopped, and then with another powerful downstroke, he began to rise. He was flying. The feeling was a revelation, an ecstasy of pure, unadulterated freedom. He circled the tower, getting a feel for the wings, learning the rhythm of the flight. He looked back at the ledge where Icarus stood, his face a mask of awe and terror. "Now, son," Daedalus cried, his voice carried on the wind. "Now." Icarus, seeing his father soaring like a great eagle, was filled with a surge of courage. He took a breath, closed his eyes, and leaped into the void. His initial fall was even more terrifying than his father's. He flailed his arms in a panic, the wings flapping uselessly. He was tumbling out of control, but then his father's voice cut through his fear. "Steady, Icarus. Feel the wind. Use it." Icarus, remembering his father's lessons, began to beat his wings with a steady, powerful rhythm. He felt the lift, the same miraculous sensation that had saved his father. He was no longer falling, he was flying. A laugh of pure, unadulterated joy burst from his lips. He followed his father, and together they soared away from the tower, their prison, leaving the island of Crete behind them. The initial moments of the flight were a symphony of shared triumph. They flew side by side, their shadows gliding over the surface of the wine-dark sea. They looked down and saw the world from the perspective of the gods. Fishermen in their small boats looked up in astonishment, mistaking them for divine beings. A shepherd tending his flock on a hillside dropped his staff, his mouth agape. The world below seemed small and insignificant. Up here, in the vast, empty expanse of the sky, they were masters of their own destiny. Daedalus, ever the cautious one, led them on a steady course, keeping to a safe altitude, the middle path he had so carefully described. But Icarus was young, and the sensation of flight was an intoxicating drug. He was not content to follow. He wanted to explore. He began to test the limits of his wings, of his own abilities. He would dive towards the sea, pulling up at the last minute, his wingtips skimming the waves, the cool spray on his face a thrilling shock. He would then climb steeply, his heart pounding with the exertion and the sheer joy of the ascent. Daedalus would shout at him, his voice thin in the wind, "Icarus, the middle path, stay with me." But Icarus was lost in the ecstasy of the moment. The warnings of his father seemed like the cautious ramblings of an old man who did not understand the true glory of flight. He was a god of the air. He could go anywhere, do anything. He looked up at the sun, a brilliant golden orb in the vast blue of the sky. It seemed to be calling to him. He wanted to get closer. He wanted to fly higher than any bird, higher than any man had ever dared to go. Daedalus watched in growing horror as his son soared upwards, a small, dark speck against the brilliant canvas of the sky. He shouted his name, his voice raw with a father's desperate fear. "Icarus, come back, it is too high, the sun." But his cries were lost in the wind. Icarus was deaf to everything but the song of his own hubris. He climbed higher and higher, the air growing warmer. He felt the heat of the sun on his face, a pleasant, soothing warmth at first. He felt invincible. He was no longer Icarus, the son of Daedalus, the prisoner of Minos. He was a celestial being. But then the warmth became a fierce, burning heat. He felt a strange, trickling sensation on his shoulders. He glanced down and saw, to his horror, that the wax that held his wings together was melting. It was running down his arms in greasy, golden rivulets. A small feather, then another, detached from his right wing and fluttered away. He felt a sudden lurch, a loss of lift. Panic, cold, and absolute replaced his exhilaration. He tried to flap his arms harder, but it only made things worse. More feathers came loose, caught by the wind and scattered like snow. He could see them drifting away below him. The elegant, carefully constructed architecture of his wings was disintegrating. He looked down and saw his father, a small, distant figure, circling helplessly below, his cries of anguish now reaching him. The reality of his situation, the terrible, fatal consequence of his own arrogance, hit him with the force of a physical blow. He tried to call out to his father, but the only sound that came from his lips was a choked, terrified sob. His wings were now just bare, useless frames. He was no longer flying. He was just a boy, thousands of feet in the air, with nothing but empty sky between him and the hard, unforgiving sea below. He began to fall. The wind shrieked past him, a final, mocking scream. He flapped his bare arms in a useless, pathetic imitation of flight. He saw the world rushing up to meet him, the blue of the sea, the white of the waves. His last, fleeting thought was of his father's warning, the wisdom he had so carelessly ignored. Then, with a sickening impact, he hit the water and was swallowed by the waves. As Icarus fell, Daedalus watched in horror. The father's desperate cries were swallowed by the vast, indifferent sky. He could do nothing but circle helplessly, a great man-made bird of sorrow, and witness the final, terrible moments of his son's life. The boy, who had been a god of the air just moments before, was now a small, flailing figure, plummeting towards the sea. The wings, the magnificent symbols of their shared dream of freedom, were now just tattered, useless appendages. Icarus hit the water with a distant splash, a small punctuation mark at the end of his short, tragic story. The waves of the sea, which would forever after bear his name, the Icarian Sea, closed over him and he was gone. In that moment, the silence of the sky was more deafening to Daedalus than any roar of the Minotaur. He was alone. The grief that washed over Daedalus was a physical force, so powerful that it almost sent him spiraling down into the sea after his son. His own wings, the marvel of engineering that had carried him from his prison, now felt like a leaden shroud. He forced himself to descend, his movements clumsy and erratic, his mind numb with shock. He landed on a small, rocky, uninhabited island nearby, his legs collapsing under him as his feet touched the ground. He stood on the shore, his eyes scanning the waves, desperately searching for a sign of his son, a piece of wreckage, anything. But there was nothing. Only the endless, rolling blue of the sea and the mocking cries of the gulls. He began to walk the coastline, a frantic, stumbling patrol. His cries of Icarus, Icarus, were hoarse and raw, a father's primal scream of loss hurled into the wind. For hours he searched, his hope dwindling with the setting sun. Finally, as the sky began to bleed into the purples and oranges of dusk, he saw it. Bobbing gently in the surf, tangled in a mess of seaweed and the scattered, broken feathers from his own wings, was the pale, still form of his son. Daedalus waded into the cold water, his heart a dead weight in his chest, and gathered Icarus into his arms. The boy was gone. His brilliant, beautiful, reckless boy was gone. Daedalus carried him to the shore and collapsed on the sand, holding the lifeless body of his son, his own silent tears mingling with the salt spray of the sea. As the moon rose, Daedalus knew he could not leave his son to the elements. With his bare hands, he began to dig a grave in the sandy soil at the base of a rocky outcrop. It was a slow, grueling process, his hands quickly becoming raw and bloody. But he worked with a grim, focused intensity, the physical pain a welcome distraction from the unbearable agony in his soul. He laid his son gently in the shallow grave and covered him with stones, building a small, simple cairn. As he placed the last stone, he looked down at the pathetic little mound that marked the end of his family line, and his grief finally gave way to a bitter, corrosive rage. He stood up and cursed the gods. He cursed the sun for its cruel heat. He cursed the sea for its indifference. But most of all, he cursed himself. He cursed his own cleverness, his own ambition, his own pride. He had been so obsessed with his own genius, so confident in his ability to conquer any challenge, that he had failed to see the most obvious danger of all, the reckless heart of his own son. He had built the wings, but he had failed to build the wisdom to use them. The tragic fall of Icarus was the inevitable result of his own hubris. In that moment of terrible clarity, he wished he had let them both rot in Minos's tower. A life in chains with his son would have been a paradise compared to this desolate freedom. He named the island Icaria, a permanent, desolate monument to his own catastrophic failure as a father. But even in his grief, the instinct for survival was strong. He knew that King Minos would be hunting him. The king's vengeance would not be sated by the death of a boy. He would want Daedalus, the man he blamed for his humiliation. Daedalus could not stay on Icaria. He had to keep moving. He patched his own damaged wings as best he could, and with a heavy heart he took to the air one last time. The flight was no longer a joyous act of liberation. It was a grim, mechanical process, a means to an end. He flew west, his back to the rising sun, leaving the grave of his son and the scene of his greatest sorrow behind him. He eventually made his way to the island of Sicily, a land far beyond the reach of Minos's immediate power. There he sought refuge at the court of King Cocalus of Camicus. Cocalus was a shrewd and powerful ruler, and he was well aware of Daedalus's fame. He He saw the propaganda value in having the most famous inventor in the world in his court. He welcomed Daedalus with open arms, offering him protection, a new workshop, and a place of honor. Daedalus, his spirit broken, accepted. He tried to lose himself in his work again, but the joy was gone. He built magnificent things for Kokkalis. He designed a fortress with impregnable walls, a great reservoir to supply the city with water, and a system of underground steam baths that were the wonder of the age. He created beautiful, lifelike golden honeycomb for a temple to Aphrodite. But his creations were hollow, lifeless things to him now, his hands simply going through the motions. His heart was buried on a lonely island in the middle of the Aegean Sea. King Minos, however, was not a man to give up on a grudge. His rage had festered into a cold, obsessive need for revenge. He had to find Daedalus. He had to make him pay. He knew that the inventor was too clever to be found by conventional means, so he devised a challenge, a subtle trap for a brilliant mind. He began to travel from city to city throughout the Mediterranean world, taking with him a beautiful, intricately spiraled Triton seashell. At each court he visited, he would issue a challenge by offering a vast reward to any man who could pass a single linen thread through the entire length of the spiraling shell without breaking either the thread or the shell. It was a seemingly impossible puzzle, one that he knew would appeal to Daedalus's unique problem-solving mind. Eventually, Minos arrived in Sicily and presented the challenge to King Kokkalis. Kokkalis, knowing Daedalus was in his court, took the shell to the old inventor. Daedalus, just as Minos had predicted, could not resist the puzzle. He held the shell in his hands, his old craftsman's mind whirring back to life for the first time in years. He came up with a simple, ingenious solution. He captured an ant and tied the fine linen thread to its body. He then bored a tiny, almost invisible hole at the very tip of the shell's spiral. He smeared a drop of honey on the hole and placed the ant at the large opening of the shell. The ant, smelling the honey, dutifully crawled through the winding, labyrinthine chambers of the shell, dragging the thread behind it, until it emerged from the tiny hole at the other end. The riddle was solved. Kokkalis, immensely proud, took the threaded shell back to King Minos. The moment Minos saw it, a triumphant, cruel smile spread across his face. He knew he had found his man. He dropped all pretense of a friendly visit and demanded that Kokkalis hand over the fugitive Daedalus immediately. Kokkalis was now in a difficult position. He was bound by the sacred laws of hospitality to protect his guest, but he also feared the military might of the king of Crete. He decided to use deceit. He agreed to hand over Daedalus, but he insisted that Minos first rest from his long journey and honor him by being his guest at a banquet. He offered the Cretan king the use of his magnificent new steam baths to refresh himself. Minos, his victory seemingly assured, accepted the offer, but it was a trap. As the Cretan king was enjoying the luxurious steam, the daughters of King Kokkalis, who had grown very fond of the gentle old inventor and the wonderful, animated toys he made for them, took matters into their own hands. They barred the doors of the bathhouse, and using a secret system of pipes that Daedalus himself had designed, they diverted a channel of boiling water directly into the king's bath. Minos was scalded to death, his screams of agony unheard over the hiss of the steam. His death was officially ruled a tragic accident. The great King Minos, the son of Zeus, the master of the Aegean, met his ignominious end not on the field of battle, but in a bathtub, his vengeful quest finally over. Daedalus was finally free from the threat of Minos, but his freedom was a hollow, joyless thing. He lived out the rest of his long life in Sicily, a figure of respect and renown, but a man haunted by his past. His story, and the tragic story of his son, became a cornerstone of Greek mythology, a timeless and powerful allegory about the human condition. It is a story about the creative and destructive power of genius, about the eternal tension between fathers and sons, about the intoxicating allure of freedom, and most famously, about the dangers of hubris. The fall of Icarus is a lesson that has echoed through the ages, that our greatest ambitions, if not tempered by wisdom and humility, can lead to our most devastating falls. It is a reminder that even when we have the ability to soar, we must never forget the laws that bind us to the earth and the warnings of those who have flown before us. Now, why don't you boys have a good night, and I'll see you tomorrow for our next story. And to our listeners, if you also like my stories, please subscribe and join us for our next mythical story as well. In the meantime, please have a nice day or a good night wherever you are.